All right, gentlemen, this is our third installment of our Sport in America lectures for the summer. So last time you learned about basically sport in general, in the 1800s, how it became to even be games going into sports, why they were important to people, why people were even latching on to these, how they became important, how they became popular, and we connected to various different things that were changing in American history. Right? You have people moving to cities. You have people getting different types of jobs. You have the upper class trying to keep the lower class out of things. You had people wondering what to do with their leisure time, their new leisure time. So all these things connect together when we look at the history of sports. So I want to get a little more specific this time. That was a general overview. We're going to look at one sport more specifically, and one that perhaps is the most popular of the time, if it's not the most popular of this period. Remember, we're looking at the quote unquote industrial era, which I'm saying is 1860s to 1930s or 1940. Um, it might not be the most popular, but it's one of the top three. And you could probably make a good argument that is the most popular. And that's baseball. Um, this is the sport I have the most expertise in talking about its history and how we can relate it to America. I'm sure you've heard it called many times America's pastime. So this is a great way to connect sports to America through this sport. So I'm going to, per usual, start sharing my screen. Actually, wait, hold on one second. All right, now I'll do it. Sorry about that. Beautiful. All right, let's talk about baseball. Um, so I'm starting this date at 1869 because that is when the Cincinnati Red Stockings fielded the first openly professional team. Sometimes people confuse this and say the Red Stockings were the first professional team. That's not true. There were definitely players paid to play baseball before this. The Red Stockings were just the first ones to say, "Yeah, every single one of our players is paid, and we don't care if you know." Remember, we talked about amateurism, how that's kind of a big deal. People admitting it at that time. So that's why I'm starting in 1869. Here's some key themes here. Pastoral myth that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you right now. Hopefully, it will over the next 45 minutes. National identity and values. Right? We call baseball the national pastime. That's how we're going to talk about it. Capitalism, right? Money. Again, money, money, money always has something to do with it, especially in baseball's case, labor versus management. What I mean by here is workers versus bosses, essentially. And then assimilation. How do we assimilate immigrants into being American? Baseball plays a role in that. Okay. So let's start off here. Baseball evolves, and you see I underline evolves. It is not invented. Abner Doubleday does not invent baseball in Cooperstown, 1839. Alexander Cartwright does not invent baseball in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1845. It evolves from all these different bat and ball sports. Okay. Remember, I told you about round ball, old cat, town ball. Okay. I could think of a couple other variations of it too. These are all types of bat and ball sports that were around in the 1700s and 1800s that were similar to baseball, but they hadn't evolved into becoming baseball. Okay. So these social clubs that are forming in these cities with these new men moving to the cities looking for community, they're starting to play these bat and ball games. Okay. And the one that happens to kind of evolve in New York City becomes the dominant one. That becomes baseball. Okay. Baseball evolves from New York City. People actually called it the New York game. People were still playing town ball. I think town ball was biggest in Boston, I want to say, or Philadelphia. No, town ball was big in Philadelphia. Old Cat's big in Boston area. People are still playing these games in the 1840s and 1850s, but they're starting to die out as baseball becomes the dominant thread of bat and ball games. Okay. And with the ease in transportation and communication, right, people are able to talk about these things easier. They're able to travel to play each other, and that's going to standardize the game further. Okay. So the New York version becomes dominant. Um, just some examples of some early clubs. The Mutual Club, the Knickerbockers Club, right? That's actually where the New York Knicks, the basketball team, gets their name from Knickerbocker. The Eckford Club, the Atlantic Club, the Excelsior Club. These are really powerful clubs in the 1850s when the sport change becoming more competitive. Whereas before it was more of a networking or socializing event, as we mentioned before. These clubs are the first ones to really get in on the competitive angle of it. Okay, in New York and Brooklyn. Brooklyn was a separate city at that point. I think I briefly mentioned this last time, but Brooklyn doesn't become part of New York City until 1898. It's actually its own city. Okay. Um, so these players in these clubs, they're trying to portray themselves as gentlemen amateurs. What I mean by that is, hey, we're these middle or upper middle class guys. We're like accountants, we're lawyers, we're clerks with these type of jobs. We don't play for money because we don't need to. We do it for the love of the game. We're going to keep these poor guys out, right? But actually, they're starting to get paid, all right? Because as we mentioned before, like I said, we already touched on this. If you start to get competitive games and people are willing to pay for those competitive games, well, you're going to have to give an incentive to get the best players in order to win those games, because then people won't come to watch you if you stink. Right? It's a whole cycle like that. The Civil War is really big for baseball in the 1860s. But, soldiers from the New York area kind of spread this game throughout to their other Union compatriots in the army. Also, when they're in Confederate prison camps. So, like for here, this lithograph is from a Confederate prison camp. Union soldiers playing baseball, and even the Confederate soldiers are now learning how to play it from the South. Okay, so that helps spread the game, especially after the Civil War. It's this huge rupture in America, right? Over 600,000 men die in 4 years. That's over 2% of the population. Okay, 2% of the population probably doesn't sound like much, but if that happened today, 2% of the population just disappeared. That's 6.5 million people. It's a lot of people. Okay. Um, and people are looking to bind the nation back together. We want to bind up the nation's wounds and have national unity again. Okay. And baseball is actually a great way to do that, to find unity in this new game, this new sport that's spreading around. Okay. So the Civil War is really key for the growth of baseball. Baseball becomes big pretty quick. It is a quickly popularizing sport. Okay. Before the 1870s, baseball was a lot different. Lots of rule changes. If you watched a game in the 1850s, it would be very strange. It's like, all right, I see it's a bat and ball sport. They have bases. There's a guy throwing it. Okay. Um, but it's a really different looking sport. And even into the 1870s, it's different, right? Pitchers still had to throw underhand. Batters could ask where they wanted the ball. Um, until the 1850s, you could uh, peg a guy essentially and get him out. Right? They would call it washing. You could just throw the ball at the guy and that would make him out when he's running the bases. Lots of different changes. It's changing all the time in the 1800s. So some of the big differences: people weren't wearing gloves yet. Really weren't wearing gloves until the 1880s, and even in the 1880s, these gloves were not very protective. They looked really flimsy. I just mentioned about the goal of pitching. Originally, the goal of pitching in baseball is to put the ball in play. The pitcher is not trying to get the batter out. The pitcher is there just to facilitate the game. He's there to lob up a pitch. The batter puts it in play, and then it's fun to watch how the batter can run around the bases, or the people in the outfield can throw the batter out, or the infield. Right? The goal of pitching was not to strike people out. As the game becomes more competitive, pitchers are not content to just stand by and get lit up. So they start changing. They start throwing curveballs. They start moving their arm a little bit up. They start throwing harder. They put a mound to make it easier to pitch. Okay. All of these things are changing. And the sport's also becoming professionalized. Okay. The first real like national organization of baseball, you could just call it the National Association. That PBBP means Professional Baseball Players. It's a mouthful, I know. In 1871. Major League Baseball doesn't currently recognize this as a major league, but many people do recognize this as a major league in 1871. I think I would recognize it as a major league. I would consider it one if I had a gun to my head. Um, Now, there was an amateur league before that, the National Association of Baseball Players, but they're realizing, hey, we're all pretty much professional by this point. Let's just call ourselves what it is, right? And so originally they're forming these teams as things for the players, right? It's called the National Association of Baseball Players. It's for the players. The players are sharing in the profits that the fans are bringing in with their ticket prices. Okay. It's not just going to these fat cat owners far away, right? The players are owning their own teams. It's a big deal. Okay. Workers, right? They're workers. Players are workers. We're going to get into this later, but like they're It's their job. They are professionals at baseball. It is their job. So the workers are the ones who are owning the means of production in this case, if you want to phrase it that way. Okay. Um, this is pretty important, right? It's going to change pretty soon, but there is a period where the workers, so to speak, have all the power in professional baseball. That changes soon. But a fun tidbit: the Braves, the Atlanta Braves, they date their founding actually to this league in 1871, so they consider themselves the oldest professional baseball club. Um, I'll give them that. Yeah, I would probably call them the oldest professional baseball club, even if Major League Baseball does not recognize the 1871 National Association. In 1876, everything changes. Okay, the players lose their power. The National League forms in 1876. So there's some rich guys who wanted to make some more money through baseball, and they said, "Hey, why are these players able to make all the money from it, and we're left holding the bag? We should be the ones benefiting from it. We're building the stands, we're selling the tickets, we're moving and shaking, right? We should make the money." So they basically kick out all the small franchises that players ran, right? The National Association had a lot of tiny franchises. I believe the buy-in to the league was like $5. Now $5 is a lot more back then, but it's still not a whole lot to buy yourself into the Major League Baseball. I forget exactly what the fee was raised to, but it was raised a lot higher than $5. So you keep out all these smaller markets. Only teams in big cities can get in. Teams that have guys with a lot of money owning them can get into the league. Okay. Um, so the Cubs actually date their founding to 1876 when the National League starts. And basically, it's really this guy right here, William Hulbert, who kind of takes the bull by the horns and knocks all the players out of control and puts the club in control, puts the owners in control, right? Not the guys on the field. Shoot. Did it kick me out again? Yes, I'm still here. I hate when it does this. All right, we're back. He's saying, look, the owners are controlled, not the players. And you can actually see this reflected in the name. It's actually the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, not players. National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, right? The owners are at the forefront, not the players. So there's this interesting thing that starts in the 1879, really 1880, called the Reserve Clause. And this is going to be the topic of your discussion question for this week. Okay. What is the Reserve Clause? You may have heard of this before. You may not have, but it was a pretty important thing in baseball for 100 years. So what happens in this league, even though owners have control now, it's not a player-ran league, players are still running all over the place, right? They might sign a contract with one place, say Philadelphia. Then maybe Chicago gets in there 2 months later and says, hey, we could pay you more. And the player just leaves in the middle, sometimes in the middle of the game. He'll just leave and go to the next team. Maybe 6, 7 times a year, right? They didn't sign yearly contracts. There was nothing binding them to that team. And the club owner is like, hold on a second. This is costing it. This is driving up prices, right? Because the more competition you have amongst teams trying to get a player to play for them, the more expensive that player is going to be, right? They're going to be able to drive up the price. The owner is saying this is costing us too much money, right? Our fans can't really, latch on to these players. They can't celebrate these players because they're gone so quick. We got to find a way to keep them with us. And so what ends up happening is they institute this thing called the reserve clause. Okay. Originally, it only mattered for the 5 best players in the team. By 1880, it matters for everybody. Here's what the reserve clause says. If the player doesn't sign a contract with the team, that doesn't mean he can play anywhere. That team, that club, that owner still reserves or keeps his rights for that next year, even if he doesn't sign a contract. So you might think, okay, well, whatever, it just keeps him for a new year, no big deal. But in practice, this was used to keep that player there forever. He could not choose where he wanted to play. Okay. If let's put it in these terms, I'm a teacher at St. Augustine Prep. It's my job, right? I'm a worker. If I saw, hey, you know what, Paul the Six is offering me a lot more money, I think I want to go work there. Nothing's stopping me from going there. St. Augustine Prep cannot stop me from doing that. I have the freedom to move to work where I want to. That's not the case in professional baseball after 1880. You could not sign a contract with your team. You could disagree on what the owner wanted to pay you and not sign a contract, but no other owner would sign you. You were stuck with that team. This sounds pretty unfair, right? This should sound pretty unfair from a player's perspective. They have no freedom or very little freedom, right? If they're unhappy with their situation or they wanted a raise, well, why is the owner going to give them a raise? Where are you going to go? The owner's probably going to say, where are you going to go? You have nowhere else to go. I have you. You're on my team. You will take what I pay you. You have no choice to go anywhere else. Now, the owner's going to say, hey, listen, these tiny clubs, even though we kicked out a lot of the really small clubs, there are still some, lower revenue teams. They can't make as much money. They can't afford the star players. The richer clubs are just going to poach these guys. So we need to keep these guys on that smaller teams to make it a more competitive league, right? Let's have the fans have favorite players on these smaller teams. Let's not just have them be farm teams for the the more rich teams in the bigger cities. I guess that's a compelling argument in some cases, right? But it really does take away the freedom of the players to move. And as I said before, it's going to keep the salaries low. The players can't get their market value if they can't compete with other franchises competing for their services. They have no choice. They have nowhere to go. And this is really a big change in baseball at this point. This affects baseball for the next 100 years. So for the next 25 years or so, the National League is dominant. Okay, the National League is the professional baseball league. It's the top dog professional baseball league. Other leagues try to challenge it. The American Association has some success in that. Doesn't last that long. Union Association only lasts a year. The Players League, which is the players trying to take back control, like they had in the National Association, that only lasted a year in 1890, and that fails. Okay, the National League is dominant. They are like a dictator. They run baseball with an iron fist. They don't allow any competition. You see, I have OB there in quotation marks. That means organized baseball. That's what they're called. Organized baseball. Okay. National League rules with an iron fist. So there's still some more innovations happening in the 1880s and 1890s. Again, I told you the pitchers go up on a mound instead of just a pitcher's box like a softball has. It's pushed back to 60 feet 6 inches when pitchers become too dominant. So remember, baseball originally wasn't even supposed to have pitchers be competitive at all. And by the 1890s, they're too dominant because the mound was only 50 feet away. So they pushed it back 10 more feet. That gives batters a lot more reaction time to be able to hit a ball. Okay. Catchers begin putting equipment on. Now think about it. If guys are throwing a lot harder, they're throwing deceptive pitches like curveballs, right? You're going to want to protect yourself if you miss the ball and it hits you. Okay. So catchers, before they had equipment, if guys were throwing hard, they might stand really far back from the plate, which is going to make it hard to call balls and strikes. Now they're starting to move back up towards the plate again. They're wearing kind of primitive shin guards, chest protectors, catcher's masks, and catcher's mitts. Okay. Teams are changing all the time. They're always changing their nickname. They're moving cities all the time, right? The Philadelphia Phillies actually started in Worcester. Actually, no, they started in Troy, New York. Then they go to Worcester, Massachusetts. Then they go to Philadelphia, right? The Brooklyn Dodgers, before they're the Dodgers, they had a million different nicknames. Same with the Cubs. They were the Chicago Colts, the Chicago Orphans. There was the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers, right? They had a million different nicknames. Everything's always changing. The 1890s are pretty bad, actually, in baseball, the National League. There's not a lot of competition. It's just a couple teams are really good every year, and the championship's pretty much decided by July. So there's not really a whole lot of interest in the pennant race. There's a lot of gambling scandals. Baseball's trying to make itself look good to the public, so they buy tickets to go see it. But a part of people's interest in the game is their ability to gamble on it, and that looks really bad in polite society. People don't really smile upon that, and there are a lot of scandals with players throwing games for money, players being suspended for or banished from baseball for conspiring with gamblers to throw games. Right? It's a lot of bad things going on in the 1890s. And we're going to come to how that affects baseball coming up. So you may have heard Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball. He's the first black player in professional baseball. It's actually not true. He re-breaks the color line. Okay. In the 1870s and 1880s, there were African-American baseball players. Okay. This guy at the top, Octavius Catto, he's an interesting person. If you've ever been to Philadelphia, if you go to City Hall in the middle of the city, in Center City, there are statues of many people outside of it. One of the statues is of Octavius Catto. Okay, he was actually he was impressive in a lot of different ways. He was a civil rights pioneer in the 1860s. He actually got killed when he was trying to be among the first black people to vote in 1870. But he was also a great athlete. He had this team called the Pythians, which were all black, and they were the first black team to play a white team in 1869. Fleet Walker, you may have heard of him. He's becoming more known nowadays. He's really the last black player to play in the major leagues before Jackie Robinson. This is in the early 1880s. Around America at this time, there's a brief time after the Civil War where things were starting to go better for freed slaves, for black people in general, during Reconstruction, and then it starts going back downhill. And baseball mirrors that, right? So you had some black players in the major leagues, but then Cap Anson, who is a Hall of Famer, he's the first guy with over 3,000 hits. Unfortunately, he went to my alma mater, University of Notre Dame, and I say unfortunately because he is a world-class bigot. This guy is a huge racist, and he says, my team's just not going to play that team. And he probably said a couple slurs about the black players on the team. He's like, if they're out there and playing, we're not going to play. And Cap Anson had such sway that all the other teams are like, oh, okay, we'll go all white because we want to play. So by 1887, leagues are actually putting rules and forbidding teams to sign black players. Okay. And like I said, it coincides with the more general application of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is the regime in the South where blacks are not first class, they're second class citizens, right? They're segregated, they're treated poorly. This is kind of descending in the South around the and the North, to be fair, in the 1880s and 1890s, and it coincides with what baseball is doing as well. And so it takes 60 more years for that color line to be. It takes 60 more years for that color line to be rebroken by Jackie Robinson in 1947. So this is really a dark moment for baseball and America. So as I said, the National League's having a lot of problems in the 1890s, from gambling scandals, boring seasons, etc. So it's ripe to be challenged. Somebody can come in and take the mantle and say, we're going to be the more interesting baseball product. And the American League does that. It's a minor league in 1900 called the Western League. Then they say, hey, you know what? We're a major league in 1901. We're going to call ourselves the American League, and we're challenging the National League. This is the guy who founded it, Ban Johnson. He says, look, we're going to be a cleaner alternative. We're not going to have gambling problems. We're going to make sure our players are sober. Believe it or not, drunken players were a big problem at this time. A lot of players played drunk. And there would be a lot of fights on the field because of that. So he's like, no, the American people want a cleaner form of baseball. No gambling, no booze. We're going to take all your best players, National League, and we're going to pay them more because you don't allow them to move anywhere. And the National League, they've been, supreme for so long. Like, no big deal. We'll fight this and we'll win. But they realized pretty soon, shoot, we're not going to beat the American League. We're going to have to compromise with them. So they sign an agreement and say, hey, we can both be major leagues. Now, the American League agrees to the reserve clause too, along with this, which is funny considering how they stole all the players from the National League. But now they're going to agree to the reserve clause. They're both going to be major leagues. And so now the first World Series is able to happen, right? They had a World Series before in the 1880s, but it was really only among National League teams. Now you have a World Series among teams from each of these leagues, and it starts in 1903. Originally, it was only supposed to be a one-off thing. It was not supposed to be a yearly thing. So, for instance, there is no World Series in 1904, but it's brought back in 1905, and then it's been played every year since then, except for 1994 when there was a player strike. But we might have time to get into that later. So now we're getting into what's commonly called the dead ball era. You may have heard this term before, okay? The ball itself is pretty dead, okay? So first of all, you'd only use maybe 3 or 4 balls a game. If you watch a Major League Baseball game today, go watch a game, notice how many balls are used. Dozens, probably close to 100. Actually, I do know the number. I just forget it off the top of my head. It's probably around 100, give or take, okay? Maybe a little bit less. In that day, you're using 2 or 3. So what's going to happen to it? It's going to get nasty looking, right? It's going to start, getting deformities. Players were chewing tobacco and spitting tobacco. It's going to get dark colored, right? Pitchers are trying to get every advantage they can. They're going to scuff up the ball. They're going to spit on the ball. They're going to rub the ball, right? So the ball is going to look like a soft, misshapen, almost like turd-colored thing by the 9th inning, right? I'm not exaggerating. Like, it was not a white ball at all by the 9th inning. So it's going to be really hard to hit home runs like this, okay? So teams are trying to hit the ball on the ground. Hopefully they get on base, and then they can steal some bases, play quote unquote small ball to score runs. Like you see Ty Cobb here, maybe the greatest hitter of all time. Notice how he holds his hands on this bat. If any of you guys are baseball players, that's probably not the most powerful position to hold your hands apart like that. Okay. But Ty Cobb, even though he's actually one of the better power hitters at that time, he's not trying to hit home runs, right? By putting his hands further up the bat like that, he has more control of the bat. And so all he wants to do is make contact with the bat and direct it to where the fielders aren't. He's not trying to hit it over the fence because he knows he's probably not going to get a chance to. All right. So even though this ball is really hard to hit, you still have some star hitters emerge. Ty Cobb, who is the highest batting average of all time, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who my freshman guys I taught this past year should know about Shoeless Joe Jackson. Tris Speaker, a name you may not have heard of, but he was a fantastic hitter this time. But obviously, when the ball is that bad, you're going to have a ton of star pitchers. Christy Mathewson, who was known as the Christian Gentleman, as like you guys should be known as. He was actually called the Christian Gentleman. He was known for his great morality, his great comportment. Okay. Walter Johnson, they call him the Big Train. He was probably the hardest thrower of the era. He also, I actually learned this the other day, maybe yesterday. He holds the record for most pitchers extra base hits in their career. So the guy could actually hit too. And yes, Babe Ruth was a star pitcher at this time. Babe Ruth was one of the best pitchers in baseball in the 1910s. People forget that. I think people remember that where they've heard, oh, yeah, Babe Ruth was a pitcher and he moved to a hitter because he hit so well. Well, he wasn't just a pitcher. Like, he was one of the 3 best pitchers in the league when he was pitching. He was a stud. Okay. Brick and steel stadiums start to be built. So what does that mean, right? If you're building a wooden stadium, it's more rickety. It can burn up and fire. It can fall apart. That probably means you think, you know what? This game, I might not make a whole lot of money here. It's not permanent. I'm just doing it as a temporary thing. Things can change, whatever. If you build a brick and steel stadium, that is a more permanent structure. That is a more expensive structure. The guy who builds that, the owner who builds that, is saying, hey, I'm here to stay. I can make some money from this game. This is not a passing fancy for me. Baseball can be profitable on a long-term scale. I'm here to stay. All right. So that brick and steel stadium starting to about 1908, 1909, 1910 in that range. So in this dead ball era, there are some dominant, some franchises who have some good years. The Cubs win a couple World Series in the first decade of the 1900s. The Giants are usually a pretty good. The New York Giants, not the San Francisco Giants yet, are a pretty good franchise. They've won a couple World Series. But if I had to pick 2 to point out, I would say the Athletics and the Red Sox. Now the Athletics are still in Philadelphia at this point. They won several World Series. The Red Sox also won several World Series. At this time, there's only 16 major league teams, 8 in the American League, 8 in the National League. It stays that way for 50 years. It is a very small league. Okay. The leagues restrict out the teams that can come in because they want the teams they have here to make as much money as possible. Okay. The Federal League, which is a league you guys may not have heard of, it's now recognized as a major league by Major League Baseball. But originally, it challenged these 2, American League and National League, and it said, hey, the reserve clause is BS. That's not fair. We're going to take your players. We're going to ignore the reserve clause. We're just going to take your players and start a new league. And it actually worked for a little bit until the courts ruled against them. And they lost in court. And the really notable thing about the Federal League today is that you have a court case that says Major League Baseball is not subject to antitrust laws, aka the government cannot break up baseball teams as being a monopoly like they can for other industries. That lawsuit comes from the Federal League. And 2, Wrigley Field, which I'm actually going to be at in a couple days. Wrigley Field was originally Weigman Park, built for the Federal League team in Chicago. The Federal League team owner was allowed to buy the Chicago Cubs, and then he just said, hey, I'm going to move the Cubs into my field, which became Wrigley Field. I actually did my senior thesis in college on the Federal League. I could spend a million hours here talking about it, but it's not really necessary for our goals beyond saying that it challenged the reserve clause, right? It challenged the unfairness of the reserve clause, but it lost. So the reserve clause is sticking around. The Black Sox scandal. You may have heard of this. One of the most, if not the most famous scandals in all of sports. So we talked about gambling before. Gambling is a big problem, not just in baseball, but in all professional sports. A lot of the reasons why people are interested in it, if you're from, I don't know, West Virginia and you're watching a game between Boston In Chicago, you don't have a rooting interest in either team. You don't care who wins. But now if you have money on Boston winning, if you put $10 on Boston winning, all of a sudden you care. All of a sudden you're invested, right? And so gambling is actually one of the reasons why professional sports become so popular. That's how people get interested in it, which is good from some perspectives. You do want to be popular, but it can get ugly real quick, right? You can start have players, they're not playing a level game, right? They're not playing their best. They're losing on purpose to collect money from gamblers who were betting them on them to lose. All right, and that happened throughout baseball history. And baseball players really weren't making that much money at this point. I told you that um, with the reserve clause, they don't really have competition for their services, right? They can't go to say, "Hey, I'm going to go to this team. He's going to pay me more." No, you can't go anywhere. You're stuck with that team. They can pay you whatever the heck they want. So the average player at this time is making $3,000 a year. Now, again, I know that sounds like nothing. It's more money today. It's like $50,000 a year today, which is not poor. Like these guys are, I wouldn't call them poor, but they're also not rich. Like these would not be considered rich guys at this time. It's like a middle class existence, a lower middle class existence. So if you don't have that, you're not making that much money. You're kind of annoyed at your owner for not paying you enough money. Then yeah, you might be open to throwing that game. You might be open to a gambler who says, "I'm going to give you $30,000 if you lose this game on purpose," because the gambler is going to make a whole ton of money on you betting on you to lose. You might say, "Hey, $30,000, I don't make that in 10 years. Sure, I'll do it." Even if it seems morally wrong, which it may be. You may believe it's not. I believe it's probably morally wrong to do that. But if you're got, big family to feed and you're barely making, you don't know how long you're going to be in the major leagues for, then yeah, you might take that deal. And that's what happens in the 1919 World Series. Chicago White Sox were very unhappy with how their owner was treating them. One of the legends of why they're called the Black Sox, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I've heard it several times, is that the owner was so cheap he wouldn't wash their own uniforms for them. The players had to pay to wash their uniforms. And the players got so fed up with that, they're saying, "You know what, we're just not going to wash our uniforms." So they got so dirty after a couple weeks that the socks, which were white before, looked black from all the dirt and grime on them. Not sure if that's true. However, I do like the story. So gamblers come approach the players before the 1919 World Series, the most important series in all baseball, and say, "Hey, we'll give you thousands of dollars if you lose this game." And 8 of them agreed, including Shoeless Joe Jackson, one of the best players in the league. Although Shoeless Joe Jackson, he was illiterate. He probably didn't really understand what was going on, right? His play was not bad during the World Series. He was one of the best players in the World Series. His play did not get worse like the other 7. But still, he did agree to what the gambler said. I'm not going to say too much more about this. I'm going to show you a video actually coming up about it that explains some of this stuff here. I like this video because it's colorized. Now, they didn't have color video back then, but it's colored in after the fact. And I think it makes it a lot more lifelike to have that color in it. So let's watch this.
Cincinnati, Ohio, Redland Field. It's October 1st, the opening game of the 1919 World Series. The Reds take on the Chicago White Sox.
Notice how well dressed all the people in the stands are. They're not in t-shirts and shorts, right? They are dressed as well as they can in shirts and ties and fedoras.
First ever best of 9 series. Sox manager Kid Gleason is confident. He calls on knuckleballer Eddie Cicotte, who led the league in wins, to start Game 1. Cicotte and other stars like left fielder Shoeless Joe Jackson are expected to power the Sox to the title.
Shoeless Joe Jackson was so good that Babe Ruth modeled his swing after Joe Jackson. That's actually a true story. Babe Ruth has said that himself. If you look at their swings, you can tell they're very similar.
Gambling is illegal, but bookies have the Sox as 7-5 favorites. Just hours before the first pitch, Money pours in, picking the Reds to win. Crowds in New York's Times Square follow the game on a mechanical scoreboard.
This is super cool. I love this.
Updated live by telegraph.
I mean, that was cutting edge back then. There wasn't Twitter. There wasn't television. If you weren't at the game, this is how you followed it. They had the telegraph kind of beeping out the dots and dashes saying what happened, and some guy would move this ball around this board to show you what was happening. I think that's so cool from back then.
White Sox fans are stunned as Seacott gives up 5 runs in the 4th, including a triple to the Reds pitcher. Cincinnati takes the game in a laugher, 9-1. In a stunning upset, they go on to win the series 5-3. Sports writer Hugh Fullerton smells a rat. He suggests in the New York Evening World that White Sox players were fixing the World Series. A claim that casts a deep shadow on the national pastime. Shoeless Joe Jackson and 7 other White Sox are accused of taking $5,000 each to throw the series.
Again, $5,000 is maybe what they would make an entire year or 2 years. Maybe, well, Joe Jackson probably about a year, just for 3 days, 4 days, a week of work. Right, that's a lot of money to these guys.
This Chicago grand jury, the first ever film, takes statements in September 1920 from the 8 players. 3 of them confess to throwing the series. All 8 are charged with conspiring to defraud the public. Here's star pitcher Claude "Lefty" Williams, a surprising 0-3 in the series, arrives at the trial. The players get a mysterious break when the confessions go missing. The jury finds them not guilty. Baseball Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis is not so lenient. He punishes all 8 with a lifetime ban.
So I do like that video for kind of explaining the basics, but it does miss several things. So first of all, oh no, I'm hitting the wrong button. There we go. The commissioner, there was no such thing as a baseball commissioner. Make sure everything's still good here. Good. There was no such thing as a baseball commissioner before the Black Sox scandal. The owners brought him in, and actually Kennesaw Mountain Landis is the guy who ruled against the Federal League lawsuit 5 years prior. So that's kind of interesting. They brought him in to say, hey, clean up the game. Our game needs a better look. People are disgusted. People were really disgusted with what happened, and they were starting to leave the game. They didn't want to watch the game. They didn't want to pay for tickets anymore. As an emergency measure, the owners say, hey, commissioner, you come in, you can do whatever you want. You have carte blanche to do whatever you want. You discipline them however you think is best. We're going to give the reins over to you. And Landis is like, oh, okay, I'll do whatever I want. And later, he was commissioner for about 25 years. And later, when the owner said, hey, can you actually do that? We prefer you to do this. It's like, no, you told me I could do whatever I want, so I'm going to do whatever I want. Landis was a tough guy to deal with, but man, once you gave him power, he was not going to give it back. And so, yeah, they are banned for life. And if you've seen the movie Field of Dreams, or if you were in my freshman lit class and read Shoeless Joe, you know that that's the basis for that book and that movie is the 8 men who were thrown out of baseball at that time. This is a huge scandal, a massive, massive scandal in baseball. Baseball does lose a lot of fans for a time. But
Cincinnati, Ohio.
The 1920s helped save it. Really because of a couple things. Let's first talk about a new ball, a live ball, the live ball era starting in 1920. So I told you how the ball, they wouldn't change it many times during a game. By the 9th inning, it's misshapen, it's soft, it's dark, it's hard to see. There's a game in 1920 where a guy who threw submarine, now if you know anything about baseball, pitcher throwing submarine means he goes down below his waist and throws it, almost like a bowling ball, right? So that's kind of hard to see. The game was being finished up at dusk, so there were no lights at this time. The games, when it got dark, you just stopped playing the game. This was right before they would have stopped playing it, so it wasn't super bright outside. And the combination of the dark ball, the guy throwing underhand, and the darkness weather outside, the ball was pitched and thrown up and in on a player. He couldn't see it, and it hit him in the head. And this was before batting helmets. It killed him, but he died the next day. He's the only player in Major League Baseball to die from injury sustained on the field. And that back-to-back with the Black Sox scandal is a really big 1-2 gut punch to baseball. They say, we got to fix this now. We cannot have players dying on the field. So what they do is they make a livelier ball. They make a more springy, spongy ball that can be, well, it's hard on the outside, spongy in the middle, so it can, when it gets hit, it travels farther. Okay. They outlaw spitballs. They outlaw using an emery board, which is a rough board that you can rub on a baseball to make it move a lot more. They outlaw that. They outlaw any way you can doctor the baseball. They use more baseballs per game. Okay, so that's the combination of those three things: the harder, liver ball, the fact that a pitcher can't doctor it up, and that they use more of them a game is going to allow people to hit that ball farther, and you're going to get more home runs. And what do fans love? They love offense and they love home runs. Okay, so even though baseball's in a really rough position after the Black Sox scandal, plus Ray Chapman was the name of that shortstop, dying on the field. He actually died in the hospital after, but dying from something that happened on the field. Home runs bring baseball back like it would 75 years later in the steroid era. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Offense absolutely explodes. Okay, in 1919, 447 total home runs are hit among 16 teams total. Today, you might have two teams combined for 447 home runs. In 1919, 16 teams combined for that. Only 3 years later, that number's more than doubled. 2 years later, that number more than doubles. It's an absolute explosion. The game completely changes overnight. And Babe Ruth's a part of that. Okay, Babe Ruth was a pitcher who was such a good hitter that Boston could not keep him out of the field. They couldn't keep his bat off the field. And you can actually read about that a little bit if you read that book, War Fever, that I mentioned in our first lecture. Okay, Babe Ruth becomes an absolute celebrity. This guy in 1920, who was a star pitcher before, now he hit more home runs in 1920. I believe 59, either 58 or 59. He hit more home runs than all but one other team. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. That one guy was hitting more than every other team. Okay. So home runs, offense, that's bringing people back. Radio is not really a thing before 1920. By the end of the 20s, it's a huge thing. So now with radio, it might not seem high tech to you guys in the 2020s, but radio in the 1920s is one of the most high tech things out there. Now, if you're living in Wyoming, out in the middle of nowhere, and you have no access to actually physically get to a game in Major League Baseball because none of the teams are west of St. Louis, you can still listen to games. You can still be a fan. You can listen to the games. Okay, you can get into baseball. That's huge for the popularity of the sport. Don't also forget the Negro Leagues at this time. You know, again, black men are not allowed to play in the major leagues, but they have their own leagues. Now they're not as well funded. They're not as well organized. There's a lot of racism involved here, right? A lot of problems are going through every day. But the 1920s might be the time that the Negro Leagues were the most organized they ever were. And there were some great players playing in the Negro Leagues this time. Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston. These are names that should be more well known to baseball fans today, but they aren't. Okay. So 1920s are huge for baseball, right? This is a time when celebrities are being created. That's really the advent of a celebrity. There's no such thing as celebrities really before 1920s. Okay. With the radio, with the new motion picture industry, movies, right? Now you can see these people. You can hear these people from far away. They're more lifelike. People become larger than life. Okay. Sports celebrities are huge. And sports aren't the only place with celebrities in the 1920s, but it's maybe the biggest place with celebrities. Okay. And Babe Ruth's probably the biggest of all. Okay, I list some of the other ones up here. Charles Lindbergh, who does the first solo flight across the Atlantic, massive celebrity in the 1920s. Rudolph Valentino, he's a famous actor, Now, the movies were silent still in the 1920s, but movies were still very popular, even though they were silent. And Rudolph Valentino was probably the most famous and most loved actor at that time. Women swooned over him. He was a very good looking guy. Okay. Huge celebrity. When he died in the late 20s, his funeral was attended by like hundreds of thousands of people. It was insane. And then Jack Dempsey, who's a very famous boxer, he becomes a celebrity in his own right. Okay. So before I show you this short video about Babe Ruth, I think, we throw around the name Babe Ruth. It's like, oh, yeah, he's that big fat guy who hit a lot of home runs and he runs funny around the bases in the videos you see of him. Like, we got to remember, Babe Ruth was an absolute force of nature. I invite you to look up Babe Ruth's stats. They are out of this world. They are insane compared to all the other players at his time. So I don't know if you guys remember back this far, but if you remember, Reese Hoskins came up to the Phillies in 2017. It's 5 years ago. So you guys were like 10, 11, 12 years old. And he had this huge streak of home runs. He hit like 18 home runs in 30 games or something incredible. And I remember looking up his stats and saying, oh my God, his stats here, Babe Ruth pretty much did this his whole career. Like, he was this good his entire career. And we were in awe of Reese Hoskins doing it for a month. That's the type of player Babe Ruth was, okay? Everybody's like, that dude is what it means to be a powerful American man. That dude has the swagger, the confidence that America needs as we become a world power after World War One, right? After World War One, America is a world power, and Babe Ruth's kind of the representation of that. He's fun-loving, right? He gets along with everybody. He's a little bit immature, okay? But that's fine. He likes to party. He likes women, but he's also kind to children. He's very good with children, okay? People love Babe Ruth. He's on all these advertisements. You see him in the movie theaters. He's everywhere, okay? And this point I'm going to make later, but I'm going to mention it now. I'm going to talk more about it during the football session I'm going to do later. But people are really worried about machines coming in this time and that it's going to dilute the strength of American men. That American men working in offices and using these big technological machines, that means that the men are not going to be what they once were. Right. And Babe Ruth seems to say, hey, you know what? Even though we're in this mechanical, technological age, human muscle can still accomplish something. Look at Babe Ruth. So I'm going to actually show you some brief highlights here from Babe Ruth. I'm not going to show you the entire video. You can look them up. You can look them up on your own on YouTube. But yeah, this is how Babe Ruth's running funny. Like, people think he ran really funny. Now, he did have skinny legs and a, and a pretty robust upper body. But the reason his legs look like they're moving that fast is that video cameras at that time were actually cranked to move the film through. So if a guy was cranking too fast, it made everybody look like they were moving too fast. So that's part of the reason why it looks funny running around there.
Let's go the bagel Joe, and the babe sucks it into the bleachers.
That's again, he modeled his swing after Shoeless Joe Jackson. And now people could go to movie theaters and see clips like this that they couldn't before. That's huge. That's revolutionary.
Now for game number 4.
Again, you guys may be familiar with Shohei Ohtani. And Shohei Ohtani is maybe the best player we've seen since Babe Ruth because he's an amazing pitcher and an amazing hitter at the same time. So is Babe Ruth. Don't underestimate how good of a pitcher this guy was. He could do everything.
The ball pulls like a bullet when connected. This is the sight the fans came to see. Ruth circling the sacks after a circuit clout.
That's a little bit of a heavier, older Babe Ruth. The Yankees actually invented uniform numbers on the back of their jerseys, and that wasn't until the late 1920s when Babe was in his 30s. So that's a little bit of an older, fatter Babe Ruth there. So in American history, right, what comes after the 1920s? The Great Depression happens. We're not going to get into all the reasons why that happened, but the Great Depression happens. People are thrown out of work. People are very poor. They're in misery. And some estimates have that up to 30% of Americans were out of work for a couple of years there. That's a huge number. 3 out of every 10 Americans out of work. That's not good. Naturally, attendance is going to drop. People can't afford to pay for those tickets. So baseball is going to be making less money. All right. And so Major League Baseball says, how can we get this money back that we're losing because of the depression? I know. First thing, we're going to introduce an all-star game. Fans are going to love seeing all their favorite players in one spot. We're going to have an all-star game every summer. First one's 1933. Second one, the first night game. You might think, well, how does that draw more fans? Well, think about it. People work during the day. And at this time, you didn't have a lot of the same protections in your job as you do now. If you missed a day at work, you might be fired. So a lot of people just couldn't go to games if they're during the day. If you push the games to night, you allow more people a chance to come see them. You can make more money. So the first night games in 1935. The Hall of Fame opens in 1939. Right, and this is the first Hall of Fame class here. Here you see Babe Ruth. That's Connie Mack. That's Walter Johnson. I know I recognize that. Is that Eddie Collins? No, that's Grover Cleveland Alexander. I know that. I think Ty Cobb didn't show up even though he was being celebrated. Or that. No, that's not Ty Cobb. But the Hall of Fame draws a lot of visitors and fans to see it in Cooperstown. Okay. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later why it's in Cooperstown. But these are all various things to try to drive fan engagement, to drive them to spend more money, to make major league teams make money again or make more money. The Yankees through the 20s and 30s become the dominant team. The Yankees are nothing in the 1900s and 1910s. They stink. Okay. But they get Babe Ruth and they become juggernauts. They win championship after championship after championship. And when Ruth retires, well, Lou Gehrig becomes the big star. Well, he was the big star with Ruth, but he kind of carries the mantle from Ruth for a few years. When Lou Gehrig gets sick, he contracts ALS. All right, that's where you may have seen the famous video. I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Right, it's him speaking into the big microphone at Yankee Stadium. He's a legend, but he just gets replaced by Joe DiMaggio, who becomes a legend in his own right. The Yankees just keep having legends join their team and keep it a winning organization. But even through the Great Depression, organized baseball, remember OB that I said before, still all white. They do not allow black players. And the Negro Leagues really struggled during the 1930s and the Depression. Okay. If the major leagues struggled, the Negro Leagues are definitely going to struggle because they're already making less money. So it's a big problem for the Negro Leagues at this time. All right, first discussion question of the semester. Okay, I hope you watch this video before doing it and not just read the slideshow. You need to do both. I give you a lot more information in this video than just a slideshow. I'm going to send you guys an email to remind you of that. Here we go. Was the reserve clause a good thing for early professional baseball? You can absolutely make arguments on either side of this. On one side, you could say, hey, listen, these small market teams that don't have a lot of money, they got to stabilize their rosters, right? They got to be able to make some money. They can't lose all their players to the better teams. Then you're going to have no competition in baseball. Nobody wants that. That's one side. You could also say, hey, listen, it's not fair that these players can't move around. It's not fair to them. They should have the right to choose where they want to work. They should have the right to fight for a better salary, etc. There's no right answer. You can take either side of this. Now, there's one side I believe in, but even if you disagree with me, that's fine. I hope you make a good argument, even when you disagree. Maybe you can make me change my thinking a little bit. I'm not going to tell you what I believe here. Maybe you can figure out from listening to me talk already, but I'm not going to say outright what I believe. So I don't want to sway you guys too much in how you think. But there's not one right answer. Use evidence from the slides, from my speaking. Okay, when we do have readings later in the semester, use it from them to support this claim. So remember, you're doing one paragraph, you're making an argument, and then you're going to respond to somebody else's paragraph. Okay. So that was like the nuts and bolts of baseball. Let's actually talk about the meaning of baseball, and then I'll get to the primary source analysis at the end. This is one of our longer lectures, so just hang on in here. I know this is probably pretty long for you guys watching it. Trust me, it feels long for me giving it. Pretty early, it's called the national pastime. Okay, I'm sure you guys have heard this phrase before. Americans are putting a lot of their values in the sport, right? They're worried about the world becoming too much mechanization, too much technology. They're worrying that the America of our youth was really the best America, right? It's nostalgia for saying, hey, back then we all lived on farms. Everything was green and clean. People worked hard, an honest living as farmers or as artisans, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't work in these dirty factories with these dirty immigrants and all this bad stuff happening, blah, 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 right? So people have this certain nostalgia attached to baseball, which may or may not be true. Baseball really is born as an urban sport. It's not really born in fields like this, okay? But this is how people saw it, right? They wanted to believe baseball was like this because they missed a prior era. And they wanted to believe that baseball could carry on the values of that prior era, right? You could still have honest hard work. You could still have cooperation with other people, physical muscle strength, manly strength could still have a place in an increasingly technologized. Is that even a word? Technological world. Okay. Baseball is interesting in that it really celebrates individual achievement and teamwork, right? So the guy at the plate, he can hit a home run and win a game for his team just by himself, right? But by the same token, if you're pitching, it seems like you're a one-on-one matchup, which in a certain sense you are. That is an individual achievement, but also you have 8 other guys helping you field the ball and put people out. So baseball is a really interesting balance of individualness and cooperation and teamwork with it. Okay. Baseball is seen as democratic and meritocratic. Everyone's allowed to play. And if you're good, then you'll rise to the top. Now, obviously, this isn't really true because they didn't let black people play or women a lot of times, but it was seen to be that way. And we still think of sports that way. And I think sports are much more meritocratic and democratic nowadays, where if you're good, I don't care if you're poor. I don't care if you're Hispanic. I don't care if you speak another language. If you're atheist, if you're gay, none of that matters for the most part. If you're good, you will rise to the top. And people really love that. Right. So think about why we call it the national pastime and not the national sport. What does sport have to do with it? Remember, I told you sports about organization, standardization, right? Money involved, all these different things. Pastime is just something you play in the backyard for friends, with friends. It's about cooperation and teamwork and fun and relaxation and all the good things about life. Notice how I'm framing that there, right? Baseball is not about the new age. It's about this older, more kinder, gentler age that still be brought forth in the future, brought forth to the present. Okay. I think it's really interesting that's called the national pastime, not the national sport. So when people are putting these values on baseball, it's really easy to deny players' rights, right? It's like, hey, look, you're playing the great American game with all these great values in it. Why are you asking for more money? I would do this sport for free. You probably hear this a lot from maybe your parents or other people. Why are they complaining about money? I'd play it for free. You know, America's the great American sport, or baseball's a great American sport. They should be thankful that they're allowed to play it. Well, that's going to be really easy to make those arguments that players shouldn't have workers' rights when you're going to put all those values in the sport. Okay. And make no mistake, these professional players, they are workers, right? It is their job. They are professional baseball players. It's their job. Okay. But the owners are going to really have the public on their side in these cases because of all these values they put in the sport. People think baseball equals America. All right. They spent a lot of time and energy trying to find that baseball was invented in America, but it doesn't exist. Baseball was not invented in America. It evolved in America, but it wasn't invented. But damn it, they're going to find an invention for it. They're going to make sure it's invented in America. So in 1905, they put a commission together called the Mills Commission and say, find where baseball was invented. This guy, Albert Spalding, was having this beef with another sports writer. Albert Spalding was first a famous player and then became a really powerful owner. And Spalding was a smart dude. Like Spalding was a sharp guy. He did a lot of the research himself, which makes it more disappointing to me because he knows better that baseball wasn't invented. He knew baseball wasn't invented. But because he wanted to, well, for various different reasons, I wrote a paper on this, so that's why I'm getting into depth on it. He wants baseball to be seen as America, and he doesn't want, anybody else claiming otherwise. So he's going to find this guy who was actually mentally insane and I believe killed his wife, who wrote a letter saying, baseball was invented in 1839 in Cooperstown by Abner Doubleday. He's like, see, we have proof. See, this guy said it. Baseball was invented in America. It's like, actually, nobody corroborated that letter. Again, the guy was mentally unwell. Abner Doubleday wasn't even in Cooperstown in 1839. Okay, he was at West Point for his military training. None of the story made sense, and Spalding knew it. Spalding's a smart guy. He knows it doesn't make sense, but we're going to run with it anyway. Okay. Hey, Abner Doubleday, he's a Civil War general. It's even better to make him the inventor of baseball. It's much more American. That's how we're going to find our national pride, right? It's a newer country. America's a fairly new country still at this point. It's trying to form its national identity, its national tradition. And that's why it's going to want to associate baseball closely with it, right? All these new immigrants are coming to America. We mentioned this before. How do we make them American? Teach them baseball. That's a textbook on how to be American. Don't even read a textbook. Just go play baseball. That'll teach you how to be American. Our values are in that sport. Our values of honesty and fair play and cooperation, democracy, obedience, all that's in baseball, right? American Indians, too, trying to quote unquote assimilate American Indians, Native Americans to the white culture. Baseball was used. Okay. So it's really interesting how all these values are bound up in baseball. Okay. So there's an article on Canvas. I should have had Canvas already ready for you here. I don't. So I'm going to get it up here. All right, so you're going to go log into Canvas, yada, yada, yada. This is probably one of the primary sources you're going to spend more time with, so sorry about that, but you do have 2 weeks to complete it. Actually, 11 days from right now, so you still have plenty of time. Come on. So I'm going to go to student view so you can see what it looks like for you. Come on. So I have See Baseball primary source right here. You really have to watch this video to know what I want you to do. So I'm going to make sure to send an email to you guys and make sure to watch the video. This is an article from, I believe, 1911. I think it is. Yes, 1911. So this article is very old. Okay, it's from the Baseball Magazine, which was a really popular magazine back then. And it gives a really, really interesting description of baseball and how it is American values. Okay, how it equals American values. All right. So here's what I want you to read. You don't have to read the whole thing. It's like 8 pages total. You can read it if you want. You don't have to, though. Okay. You're going to read from the beginning. All right. So history of baseball, spectacular, blah, 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 blah. All right. Read all this. Keep reading. Keep reading. Keep reading. And you're going to stop here. Actually, no. Yes. No. Stop here. That paragraph you're going to read to. So that's about 3 pages or so of reading. Really not that much. What I want you to do is to read those pages. Okay. And then if we go back to the actual post, this is where you're going to submit what you write on this, right? I have an explanation of necessarily what I want you to do. Okay. You're going to read that article. I thought I wrote it here. Shoot. I just wrote it here. 1 page, give or take. What can we learn about how early 20th century Americans, like Americans in the early 1900s, from reading that article, 3 pages, what can we tell about how they felt about baseball and their country? Sounds pretty simple, right? But you actually have to read this in order to do it well. Okay. It's not too much reading. You can handle it. But I'm telling you, this is a really rich piece. It's going to really hit you across the head with how American this article thinks baseball is. Okay. So make sure you submit this by June 26th. You can write it in a text box here, right? It gives you a text box available, I believe. Or you can upload a file, or you can even speak it. If you write it down, then you want to speak it and record yourself speaking it, that's fine too. I'm all about that. Okay. As long as you're just not rambling off the top of your head, as long as you actually have organization, that's fine. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know this was a long one. I apologize. All right. So again, I'm going to email you guys to remind you about these things, especially to remind you to watch the videos. Once you watch this video, that'll take you through June 26th. And then the week after that, you'll be dealing with college football I will post that video hopefully shortly. I'll be on the road for another week and a half here. I'll still be available from email. You can still email me. I'll be able to answer that. But hopefully you learned a lot about early baseball from this session. You can show me by taking a stand on the reserve clause and then also analyzing that 3 pages of that primary source to say, hey, this is how Americans felt about baseball in their country in the early 1900s. All right. So this is the end for the 3rd lecture here. I'm going to stop the recording and I will talk to you guys later.